Welcome back, everybody. I'd like to give you some background on Ruth that might help you understand some of the aspects of it that are foreign to us a couple thousand years, maybe 3,000 years even later. We know the setting of the book because the author tells it to us right there at the beginning of the text. It's set in the period of the Judges, which is the 13th through the 11th centuries BCE. BCE is a little acronym, is that the word I'm looking for, abbreviation for before the Common Era. Biblical scholars generally use BCE for BC and CE or Common Era for AD. And the reason for that is twofold. On the one aspect of it is that many of the people that we interact with today are not Christian, and Jesus is not the focus of their timeline. And the second reason is the man who put together the timeline for us made a mistake. And we know now that Jesus actually was born somewhere between 6 and 4 BC. So he's born before himself, which really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So it helps us just make a little more sense to switch over to this. However, you can continue to use whatever nomenclature you'd like. This is the nomenclature I'm used to using. So it's set in the period of Judges. I'd like to talk a little bit with you about that time period. So I'm going to share with you a different screen here. That's my quick history of Israel from the beginnings through Roman rule. And so we're just going to look at a segment of this today. We'll come back to this handout at various points along the way in the other 3 episodes that we're going to do in this series. So we're talking first of all about the biblical period, and that refers to about 2,500 years through 300 years before the Common Era. So in the first chunk of that is the period of the patriarchs and matriarchs, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and his 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, and their 2 concubines who, their 2 maidservants who become Jacob's concubines. They create what is the Bible calls the 12 tribes of Israel. They're ethnically related to one another. Joseph, who's the son of Jacob and Rachel, leads the tribes into Egypt during a time of famine. And as we know from the book of Exodus, they become slaves there. And we also know from the book of Exodus, right, the story of Moses leading the people on a migration to Canaan somewhere in the 13th century BCE, so somewhere in the 1200s. There's a new idea generated there in that Exodus, and that's the idea of freedom as a fundamental human right. Something that's not new is that the Israelites, feel they have a special relationship with the deity and they have a divinely appointed destiny. At this point, in terms of government, they are 12 independent tribes. They do not have one united leader. They don't even have a head of a centralized head in each tribe. They have their code of life and honor, but they're not centralized in any sort of way. This period that's called the Judges, and I really don't know why it's called judge, because that certainly has a different meaning here in English than it's being used to mean here. What it means here is that in times of battle, when another community was attacking them or when they needed to attack, a military leader would rise up and be the general of the army. And then once the conflict was over, he would disappear, or she, there are some female judges, disappear back into normal life. And that's kind of a common thing that you can see anthropologically in developing societies and tribal societies. I know from my time with the Navajo that in their past, that's how they were functioning when the Americans encountered them. At this point in history, the Philistines are the enemy, and the Israelites are primarily battling the inhabitants of Canaan to take over their land. The period of the Judges ends when Saul is chosen as the first king. He is a military leader, but he's also given some other prestige and responsibility. He does not last very long as king. David becomes king in his wake, and he rules the country from 993 to 961. During that time, he brings the 12 loosely related tribes into one centralized government. The capital is in Jerusalem. Canaanite resistance, he ends that. He conquers Philistia, the Philistines, and the tribes become one people. His son Solomon increases the wealth of the community, continues that prosperous time. He builds a temple. And now in that temple, God resides. You know, up to this point, God had lived in the Ark of the Covenant where the Ten Commandments were kept, and that was kept in a sacred tent. And now God is going to reside inside the building of the temple located in Jerusalem. There's a certain sense in which people certainly knew that God is everywhere and God is greater than that location in the temple. But there's also a certain sense that the temple is the place you go to meet God. That's what anthropologists call the axis mundi of life for the Israelite people. And that's going to be a key thing, right? We worship as a people there. We have priests who worship for us and lead us in that. And we go up to Jerusalem to worship our God. Solomon's son Rehoboam is corrupt and a tyrant, and he overtaxes the tribes in the northern part of the country, the 10 tribes that reside up there, and they rebel against him and form their own community. So now you have two kingdoms, the southern kingdom of Judah and Benjamin, and then the northern kingdom that's called Israel. And they set up a capital in Samaria. So now you can see right where Samaria originates, and we have the Samaritans in the New Testament in the gospel stories. Another couple hundred years go by, and the Assyrians become the superpower in the area. They conquer the northern kingdom of Israel in 721, and they carry off 28,000 leading citizens. As was typical of the time, they then take people they rule from other countries and use them to repopulate the northern kingdom. So now there's going to be foreigners living there. And they're going to intermarry, because that's what humans do. And so you got a lack of purity of bloodlines there. And meanwhile, the captives in Assyria are also intermarrying. Another 150 years or so rolls by, and the Babylonians rise up in power, and they come and they are able to topple the southern kingdom as well. Nebuchadnezzar, after a long siege, destroys Jerusalem and the temple, takes away the king and the leading citizens again into exile for around 50 years in Babylon. Now, 50 years is a long time. Think about all that may have gone by in your life already in 50 years. People intermarry, they settle, they get used to things. So they're at the end of the Babylonian rule, they're welcome to come back to Israel. Some do, some don't. Meanwhile, the Babylonians also had sent foreigners into Judah to repopulate there, and there's been intermarriage there. So there's lots of questions and concerns about what it means to be a member of the Israelite community. The other crisis here is going to be around the fact that the temple was destroyed. And so where did God go? How can we connect with God? What does it mean to be God's people? Because, hey, did you notice God, who's all powerful and saves us and sets us free, failed to do that for us? And so what is our relationship with God? How are we to understand that now as a people? How are we to continue as God's people if there's been all this intermarriage? And of course, there's a lot of question about that then you can see threads of different opinions in different books in the Old Testament. Ezra and Nehemiah are about the restoration of the temple and the reestablishing of the covenant after the Babylonian exile. And so they're going to be very, very much pro-blood purity. And that's going to cause some problems because there isn't blood purity. But we're going to see that Ruth then becomes actually a response to it. Let me get back to my slide here just a sec. Sorry, folks. This slide, please. Okay, so if the book of Ruth is written somewhere before the exile, somewhere before that becomes a critical question, then it's just an entertaining book that kind of supports the pedigree of David, explains it a little more. Kind of think about how many people are so fascinated with the royals of Britain, and we love to watch shows on them and hear the news and find out what Harry and Meghan are doing lately, right? So the people back then are the same way. It's interesting to them to understand and be entertained by David's pedigree. However, if the book is written post-exile, then it's clearly a commentary on how do we accept non-Jews? How do we look at intermarriage? How do we understand the loss of ethnic purity that we had prior to the exile? And it's quite a contradictory position then from Ezra and Nehemiah, because clearly in this book we have someone who's the least qualified person, right? A woman, a widow, a foreigner, and she ends up being the best example you can imagine of covenant faithfulness towards God, towards a Jew, right? Towards Naomi, towards a needy person. She follows the covenant laws on helping needy people, and to the Jewish people as a whole. She supports the dynasty that they create. So that's quite an incredible pedigree she has herself, and quite an incredible statement then the story of Ruth is in terms of how we should understand God's relationship to Israelites as a covenant people. We do not know who the author is. There's some discussion among some prominent biblical theologians these days that it may have been actually a woman, because first of all, the extraordinary compliments that are given to Ruth. She's declared to be, in the final verses, better than 7 sons. Now remember, culturally at this time, sons were everything and daughters were property. Women were property. You were owned first by your father, and then you were owned by your husband. You were not allowed as a woman to earn your own money. You were restricted in so many sorts of ways. Just so that you can put some perspective on this, when we say in the Catholic Christian tradition, the 10 commandments, and we have one commandment about you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, and then we have a separate commandment about coveting your neighbor's goods. In the actual listing of those in Exodus, it's one list. The woman is part of the property, along with the slaves, along with the cattle, along with the land. So that's the status of women. So of course you want sons, and remember, the sons carry the mark of the covenant on their bodies. Women, it doesn't really matter. We don't need to put that mark there because they're not really an essential part. So here we have a book that says this woman, this foreign woman, is actually better than 7 sons, 7 being the number of perfection in ancient Israel. So she's better than a passel of guys. Oh my goodness. As Mary Ann Getty Sullivan, scripture scholar, says, this is a completely new paradigm for evaluating people. Another interesting way that scholars are beginning to think that maybe it was written by a woman is that in contrast to the other Old Testament books, the women here are proactive, they dominate the conversations, and they advance the plot. I'm quoting Alice Leafy of the Paulist Biblical Commentary here. One more kind of fun fact is that, let me step back and let you know in case you don't, that we have 2 versions of the Old Testament. One is in Hebrew, and that was used to form the canon for Protestant Bibles. The translation of that into Greek, and you'll see in later parts of the series when that happened, the translation of it into Greek, called the Septuagint, becomes the basis for the canon of Christian scripture. Of Catholic scripture. So, and interestingly, in the Hebrew version of the Old Testament, Ruth is included in the wisdom literature, along with Psalms and Proverbs and the Song of Solomon. And then for Catholics, however, it's, as in the Septuagint, placed among the historical books. So it's interesting to me that it can be considered both of those things and offer both of those things to us. I'd like to give you a little bit of a geographical tour here. If you take a look at the map on the left, you can see Canaan during the period of the Judges. So again, roughly 13th through 11th centuries before the Common Era. And just to situate us here, the body of water on the left, the Great Sea or the Western Sea, is the Mediterranean. So we're on the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. You can see in the middle bottom of the land, the Dead Sea or the Salt Sea. There's a little blue line that leads the Jordan River up north from there to the Sea of Chinnereth, which would be the Sea of Galilee in Jesus's time. You can see the 12 tribes of Israel listed in large print on the map. If we start at the top, you'll find Dan is up there. Then coming down, Asher, Issachar, Manasseh, Ephraim, Gad, Benjamin, Dan, and Judah, and Reuben. So there are our tribes and the places that they settled in what becomes Israel eventually as a whole. I'd like to point out the countries, the communities that were already in this area that had to be moved out or defeated in order for this to become the country of Israel. The Philistines are over there along the edge of the water. They're a nautical nation. Then at the bottom, we can see the Amalekites, lots of fights with Amalekites throughout the book of Genesis and throughout the Torah. Then going up the right side, the east side of the Dead Sea, we see Edom, we see Moab, and a little farther up, we see Ammon. The Bible is quite clear, the Torah is quite clear about what the Jews thought, what the Israelites thought of the Moabites. We see an origin story offered in Genesis 19. You remember that Lot flees the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah when they're being destroyed in Genesis, and his wife turns into a pillar of salt. Well, he's also got his daughters with him, his two daughters, and they flee to the mountains. And they're up there and they don't know where to go or what to do. They're at a loss. Everything's been destroyed. And it looks like that's where they're going to stay for the rest of their lives. So the two daughters, who are concerned because they don't have eligible husbands to be married to, and they know that in order to have dignity and worth, they need to have a child. So they get their father drunk on 2 nights. And on one night, the one sister sleeps with him. And on the other night, the other sister sleeps with him. And out of those sexual unions, a son Moab is born and a son Ammon is born. So this is the most insulting possible way of describing the genesis of these two communities. We have legally stated in Deuteronomy 23 that no Moabite can ever be admitted into the community of the Lord. And the insult that's behind that is that when the Israelites were trying to infiltrate Canaan, Moab refused to succor them. They refused to give them a place to stay, to support them with food and arms. And so they have become dreaded and hated enemies for a long time. A couple of facts that may help with a little bit of the legal and cultural background here. There is within ancient Israel a practice called levirate marriage. Levir is the Hebrew word for a brother-in-law. And so what this says is that if a man were to die without a male heir, then his brother should marry the dead man's wife. And the first child, the first male child that they have, will be considered the son of the dead man. Now, why would they do this? Why? Because clan is so important. Clan must be carried out. We're going to carry on the name of the patriarch of the clan, whether it's Judah or Dan or Issachar, and we need to continue that. There is no belief in the afterlife at this point in time, and so one lives immortally by having a line of descendants, and that's how you stay alive. So as a community and as an individual, levirate marriage is very important. We also find in the Torah rules about caring for the widow, the orphan, and the alien. God is quite clear about that. In Deuteronomy 24, it's talking about when you're harvesting, and it says, don't go over it too thoroughly. Don't go over it 2 times when you're picking. Leave some for the aliens, orphans, and widows, because you were once slaves in Egypt, and you know how hard it is to find your way when you are a foreigner or when you don't have a way of supporting yourself. There's always that reference back to their own experience, evoking empathy from them. Twice in Leviticus, also there's a reference to this. Don't pick everything in a field. Don't pick to the edges. Leave these again for the poor, and the alien. You might have noticed in the story that Boaz does his negotiations, his transactions at the town gate. This is very common in this time period. People would gather there. So he sits down, and it's not unusual that his neighbor, his cousin would come, and he could call him over and then assemble a group of men to witness the business/legal transaction. That was common to the time. However, this notion of taking off the sandal, that we don't have any sort of other evidence that that was common at this time. I also do want to point out too about levirate marriage that according to the Torah, it's just within the immediate family. Ruth seems to be a little unusual in that it's expanding the duty of levirate marriage to every member of the clan. So we have talk of cousins and that sort of thing. So I'm going to stop sharing right now and just give a little bit of a rest here because that was quite a bit of talking. So I will end the video here. You can take a break and stretch, or you can just tune in with me in just a few more minutes and we'll start talking about the characters in the book. Thanks so much.